Somewhere above 8,000 meters on the north side of the tallest mountain on Earth, there's a spot every experienced Everest climber knows by name, even though almost none of them will say it out loud to people who haven't been there. It isn't marked on any official map. There's no sign, no plaque, nothing that would tell an outsider it matters at all. And yet, for nearly 20 years, it was one of the most reliable checkpoints on the entire route. The kind of landmark climbers use to judge their pace, their oxygen supply, and how much mountain they had left before the summit. What makes it different from every other landmark on Earth is what it actually is. Not a rock formation shaped like something familiar, not a colored marker flag left by a previous expedition, a human being, a man who died in a storm decades ago whose body settled into a shallow limestone alcove and simply never left. Because at that altitude, nothing ever really leaves. Every year, hundreds of climbers pass within arm's reach of something most of them will never talk about publicly. It isn't a rock formation. It isn't a shrine. It's a small limestone alcove barely large enough to fit 2 people if they squeeze in tight, sitting at 800 to 500 meters on the northeast ridge of Mount Everest. Climbers call it a cave, but it isn't really a cave in the way you're imagining. It's a shallow dent in the rock, just deep enough to curl into, just deep enough to disappear into if the mountain decides you're not leaving. And for nearly 2 decades, every single person who climbed Everest from the Tibetan side walked past it, glanced inside, and kept moving. Because inside that alcove was a man, not a skeleton, not a myth. A fully preserved human body curled on his side, wearing a pair of green mountaineering boots that would eventually give him a name climbers still used today. Green boots. This isn't a story about a hidden temple or a lost civilization. It's something stranger because it's real. It's recent, and it happened in front of thousands of witnesses who did nothing but keep climbing. To understand how a corpse became one of the most famous landmarks on the tallest mountain on Earth, you have to go back to May 1996, to a storm that would become one of the deadliest events in Everest's history, to a decision made by 3 men just a few hundred meters from the top of the world, and to a single afternoon that exposed something almost nobody wanted to look at. Everest doesn't kill the way most mountains kill. Below 8,000 meters, the air still holds enough oxygen to think clearly, to make good decisions, to turn back if something feels wrong. Above that line is what climbers call the death zone, and the name isn't dramatic exaggeration. At that altitude, your body is dying slowly with every breath. Blood thickens, judgment blurs. Your brain, starved of oxygen, starts making decisions a rational person would never make at sea level. People have been documented walking past dying climbers without registering what they were looking at. People have summited and descended without any memory of the hours it took. The death zone doesn't just threaten your body, it rewires how your mind processes the world around you, and that detail matters more to this story than almost anything else. Physiologists who study high-altitude climbing describe the death zone as a place where the human body is quite literally in a slow state of dying, regardless of how fit or prepared the climber is. At sea level, your blood is roughly saturated with oxygen in a way that keeps every organ functioning normally. Above 8,000 meters, that saturation can drop so low that you begin to experience symptoms similar to severe illness: confusion, tunnel vision, slurred coordination, a creeping detachment from reality that climbers sometimes describe afterward as feeling like being underwater, aware of what's happening, but unable to react at normal speed. Decision-making itself becomes a genuine physical struggle, not just a mental one. Studies and first-hand climbing accounts alike describe experienced mountaineers forgetting entire stretches of their summit day, misjudging distances, hallucinating companions who weren't there, or simply losing the ability to process complex information, like whether the figure on the trail ahead of them needs help. This is the environment every part of the story unfolds in, and it's the single most important piece of context for understanding what happened next, both in 1996 and a decade later. To make sense of what Green Boots actually was, you also have to understand the kind of season 1996 was on Everest. That May, the mountain was crowded. Multiple commercial expeditions were on both sides at the same time. Guides were pushing paid clients toward the summit in tight summit windows, hoping to beat incoming weather. The result was a traffic jam near the top on the afternoon of May 10th and May 11th. Bottlenecks formed at fixed ropes. Climbers waited in the cold for hours. And when a sudden storm rolled in, hundreds of exhausted people were strung out along the upper ridge, far from any shelter. Books and films about that season made the phrase into the worst disaster in Everest's modern history. 8 people died in a single storm. Among them were Rob Hall, the New Zealand guide who stayed with his client near the summit rather than leave her to die alone, and Andy Harris, whose radio transmissions from inside the storm became one of the most haunting records of what the death zone does to a human voice. None of these deaths, including the 3 ITBP climbers we're about to follow, happened in some faraway wilderness. They happened in front of dozens of other climbers. That visibility is part of why the season still feels raw. In May of that same 1996 spring, an Indo-Tibetan border police expedition was attempting Everest from the north, the Tibetan side, aiming to become the first Indian team to summit via that route. 6 men from the expedition pushed for the top. Partway up, 3 of them turned back, sensing the weather was turning against them. The remaining 3 kept going. Subedar Tsewang Samla, the team leader. Lance Naik Tsewang Paljor, Head Constable Dorja Morup. All 3 were experienced. All 3 believed they could make it. At around 3:45 p.m. Nepal time, they radioed down that they had reached the summit. If true, it would have been a historic achievement for the unit. They left prayer flags, ceremonial scarves called katas, and a small Buddhist offering at the top, a common practice among climbers, especially those from cultures where the mountain is treated as sacred rather than simply conquered. Samla, the leader, decided to stay longer to complete the religious rituals. He told the other 2 to start heading down without him. That decision, small as it seemed in the moment, may have cost all 3 of them their lives. Turning back from the summit of Everest late in the day is one of the most dangerous choices a climber can make, because the mountain doesn't wait for you to finish. Your ceremony, weather at that altitude can shift in minutes, visibility can vanish, temperatures can drop low enough to freeze exposed skin in a matter of seconds, and that's exactly what appears to have happened. No radio contact came after that final call from the summit. Teams below watched 2 headlamps moving slowly above a section of the route known as the second step, at roughly 8,610 meters. Neither of those lights ever reached the high camp at 8,300 meters. By the next morning, 3 men who had radioed down in triumph were simply gone, somewhere on the upper mountain, in conditions that made any rescue nearly impossible. The rumor that a body lay curled in a limestone alcove near the first step, wearing boots that looked distinctly green, began with the next season's expeditions. Climbers returning to the north side that year started describing the same figure in the same spot. He was curled on his right side, facing into the rock as if asleep, knees drawn up. The lower portion of his body was partly shielded from the wind by a small overhang. Above him, a pair of climbing Jumar ascenders were still clipped to a frayed length of fixed rope, as if he'd paused mid-climb and never unclipped. The boots were unmistakable. Nobody knew exactly who he was. Every seasoned climber who passed had a guess, but none of the guesses were confirmed for years. What happened next has been debated for almost 30 years. And the debate itself says something important about how Everest works, and how memory and blame move differently at 8,000 meters than they do anywhere else on the planet. A Japanese expedition from Fukuoka was climbing the same route that day, heading up as the storm worsened. On their way to the summit, they passed climbers on the fixed ropes, people wearing goggles and oxygen masks, faces completely hidden. The Japanese team assumed these were members of a Taiwanese expedition also on the mountain that day. They had no idea an Indian team was missing. Descending later, they reported seeing an unidentifiable figure above the second step, and one of their climbers exchanged brief greetings with a man standing near the route. At that point, the Japanese team's own oxygen supply was critically low. They needed what little they had left just to get themselves down alive. It wasn't until they reached a lower camp that they learned 3 Indian climbers were missing on the mountain above them. They offered to send help. The offer was declined, in part because sending anyone back up into that storm at that altitude, with everyone already running on fumes, would likely have added more names to the death toll rather than saving the ones already lost. A second Japanese team did go up a couple of days later and reported seeing bodies near the first step, before continuing to their own summit push. In the aftermath, accusations flew. Indian officials initially claimed the Japanese team had promised to help and then abandoned the search to chase their own summit. The Japanese team denied this. Eventually, some of the most vocal accusations were retracted, and later investigation, including a detailed account published in the Himalayan Journal, suggested a more complicated picture, that Dorja Morup had actually been helped along part of the route by Japanese climbers before being left to continue at his own slow, frostbitten pace, refusing to put gloves back on hands that could no longer manage the fine motor skill of clipping his harness onto anchor points. Whether through miscommunication, extreme altitude impairment, or the simple brutal math of high-altitude rescue, the outcome was the same. All 3 Indian climbers died on the mountain that day, part of a wider disaster in 1996 that claimed 8 lives across multiple expeditions, and would later inspire several books and films about the dangers of guided commercial climbing at extreme altitude. One of those 3 bodies came to rest in the limestone alcove at 8,500 meters. Over time, as expedition after expedition passed the same fixed route on the north side, climbers began to recognize the same figure, curled into the same shallow cave, wearing the same green boots. Nobody officially confirmed the identity for years. Climbers didn't ask questions. They simply absorbed the site into their mental map of the mountain, the way you'd remember a landmark on a long hike. Around this point on the ridge is where the fixed ropes turn. Around this point is where the wind picks up. And in that same stretch, there's a man in green boots curled against the rock who never got any further. The strongest identification, which has circulated in climbing circles for years but was never formally confirmed by Indian authorities, is that the body in green boots was Tsewang Paljor, the Lance Naik who had stayed on the mountain after his leader told him to descend. His family, like the families of most mountaineers who die in the death zone, was left with no body to bring home. Creepers in later years reported seeing prayer scarves left beside the alcove by Sherpas or by other expeditions who paused briefly to honor him. Some teams reportedly left small offerings of food. A few left coins, a few left notes. None of it ever proved that anyone from his unit had formally identified him. And because the body lay in a spot where the official Indian expedition was never likely to mount a full recovery, the nickname stuck longer than the name. Nobody knows exactly when the nickname started. It wasn't given with ceremony. It simply became the term climbers used, the way you'd casually mention a rock formation or a bend in a trail. Over years, green boots stopped sounding like a description of a corpse and started sounding like the name of a place. Climbers would radio down that they'd just passed green boots. Guides would use the cave as a checkpoint, telling clients how much further they had to go based on how far they were from it. A human being who had a name, a rank, a family, and a life before that storm had effectively become a piece of the mountain's geography. This is where the story gets harder to sit with, because it leads directly into one of the most controversial events in Everest's modern history. In May 2006, 10 years after the storm that likely created the Green Boots landmark, a British mountaineer named David Sharp was descending from the summit when his body began to fail. He had climbed without a guide, without a large support team, and by the time he reached the area near the limestone alcove, he was in serious trouble. He'd run low on oxygen. His hands had gone numb in temperatures most of us never experience outside a climate-controlled lab. By the time he reached Green Boots Cave, he was sitting upright, partially curled into the same shallow dent in the rock that climbers had walked past for a decade. He was alive. He was visibly alive. He was making sounds. He was asking as best he could for help. Climber Mark Inglis, leading his own expedition group past that same stretch of the route, found Sharp in a hypothermic state inside what climbers now recognized as Green Boots Cave. Inglis radioed down for advice on how to help him. The response he received offered no real path forward. There was no way at that altitude, with the resources on hand, to safely bring a critically hypothermic man back down the mountain. Inglis continued his own descent. Sharp died of extreme cold some hours later. According to some accounts, he may have been alive for hours after Inglis passed him, sitting in the same alcove where a body had been resting for 10 years, hoping for a rescue that never came. This story, almost impossible to process, is what happened around him while he was dying. Roughly 36 other climbers are believed to have passed the same spot that day. Some later said they assumed the still figure they saw was simply Green Boots, the familiar landmark, not a living person in the final hours of his life. It's a chilling detail, and it's also a window into exactly how altitude reshapes perception. At 8,500 meters, with your own body screaming for oxygen, with your own judgment already compromised, distinguishing a dying stranger from a body that has been part of the landscape for a decade may not have been the moral failure it looks like from sea level. It may have simply been what oxygen deprivation does to a human brain under extreme stress, when every climber's own survival is hanging by the same thin thread. That doesn't mean the incident didn't ignite outrage when the story reached the rest of the world. It did, and fiercely. Climbers, journalists, and mountaineering veterans argued for years afterward about the unwritten code of Everest, about when survival justifies walking past a dying person, about whether commercial climbing had created a culture where reaching the summit mattered more than the person struggling beside the route. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man confirmed to summit Everest, publicly criticized the culture that allowed this to happen, arguing that the drive to reach the top had, for some climbers, eclipsed basic human obligation. Others pushed back, pointing out that rescue at that altitude is almost never as simple as it sounds from the outside, that attempting to carry someone down from the death zone has ended in double fatalities more than once, and that the same storm-hearted judgment that keeps climbers alive can look from a distance indistinguishable from indifference. There is no clean answer here, and that's part of why this story keeps resurfacing. It isn't really about villains and heroes. It's about what altitude does to human beings, and about a mountain that has quietly built its own set of rules, separate from the ones we use everywhere else on Earth. The climbers you hear about when you first start paying attention to these cases tend to come from the same handful of expeditions, but the truth is that the Death Zone has been collecting stories since at least the 1920s. When George Mallory and Andrew Irvine disappeared just below the summit in 1924, and the climbing world spent decades arguing about whether they ever actually reached the top. Mallory's body was found in 1999 by a search expedition, much further down the ridge, almost certainly the victim of a fall. Irvine has never been found. For almost a century, 2 British climbers have lain on the upper mountain, with no family member, no journalist, and no one alive who knew them personally able to verify what they saw in their last minutes. The history of Everest is, on a long enough view, a history of bodies. And every modern climber knows it, whether they say so out loud or not. The David Sharp case wasn't an isolated event either. It became a flashpoint precisely because it forced the climbing world to confront a pattern that had been quietly building for years. As Everest shifted from an expedition reserved for elite mountaineers into a commercial industry serving paying clients with a wide range of experience levels, critics argued that the sheer volume of people attempting the summit each season, many of them relying heavily on guides, fixed ropes, and bottled oxygen rather than independent judgment, had created a kind of tunnel vision on the mountain itself. When your entire focus and your entire physical reserve is aimed at one single goal hundreds of meters above you, the space for noticing and responding to anything else shrinks dramatically. Some longtime climbers pointed out that decades earlier, when far fewer people attempted the mountain, and turning back was culturally more acceptable, incidents like this were rarer. Not because climbers were more virtuous, but because the traffic, the pressure, and the psychological tunnel vision of a crowded summit day simply didn't exist in the same way. Others pushed back hard against that narrative, arguing that it was too easy and too comfortable for people who had never been in the death zone to sit at sea level and pass judgment on split-second decisions made by oxygen-starved climbers fighting for their own survival. Multiple experienced mountaineers pointed out that successful high-altitude rescues above 8,000 meters are exceptionally rare for a reason. Carrying a critically hypothermic adult down technical icy terrain requires resources, strength, and stable weather that are almost never all available at the same time. Attempting it without all 3 in place has, on multiple documented occasions, resulted in the deaths of both the person being rescued and the people attempting the rescue. From that perspective, the tragedy of David Sharp wasn't a simple failure of compassion. It was a brutal demonstration of how narrow the margin for survival becomes at extreme altitude, a margin so thin that even climbers who genuinely wanted to help may have concluded correctly, or not, that stopping would cost them their own life without saving his. Green Boots himself remained in that same alcove for 18 years after the 1996 storm. An unintentional monument that thousands of climbers photographed, stepped around, and used as a marker on their own summit attempts. In 2014, members of a Chinese expedition, believed to be linked to the China-Tibet Mountaineering Association, which manages the north side of the mountain, moved the body to a less visible location. No dramatic announcement came with it. Climbers simply began noticing that the familiar shape in the alcove was gone. The landmark that had unofficially guided rope-length judgments for 2 decades quietly disappeared from view, though not from the mountain itself. Green Boots was never alone up there. Everest is currently estimated to hold the remains of more than 200 climbers who never made it back down, scattered across routes on both the north and south sides. Many are impossible to retrieve safely, sitting in locations so exposed and so high that any recovery attempt risks the lives of the team sent to bring them home. Weight limits on porters, the sheer physical difficulty of moving a frozen body down technical terrain, and the extreme cost of high-altitude recovery operations mean that for most of these climbers, the mountain that killed them has also become where they remain permanently. Other bodies have earned their own grim nicknames over the years. A climber named Frances Arsentiev, who died in 1998 during her descent after successfully summiting, became known among climbers as Sleeping Beauty, her body visible in a similar shallow alcove near the route, still wearing her climbing harness until it was finally moved out of sight in 2007 by a Sherpa team who put themselves at risk during a dedicated recovery ascent. Her husband, Sergei Arsentiev, who had gone back up the mountain looking for her that same night, also died and was never found. Their 2 children, who had stayed at base camp, lost both parents on the same mountain within hours of each other. Further down the mountain, an area strewn with the bodies of climbers and brightly colored gear earned the nickname Rainbow Valley, a name that sounds almost peaceful until you understand what it actually describes. From a distance, it looks like piles of fleece and nylon in soft pastel shades. Up close, the colors come from the same brightly colored expedition suits many climbers wear in the death zone to be more visible in a storm. The valley's right under the main route, at a stretch of trail where people fall most often. Climbers have written about walking through it with eyes half closed, trying not to match the colors to the climbers they remember from base camp jokes just a few days earlier. On the mountain's south side, another well-documented case involved Hannelore Schmatz, a German climber who successfully summited in 1979 but died during her descent at roughly 8,300 meters. For years afterward, her body sat upright against a rock near the trail, eyes reportedly open, hair blowing in the wind, until it was eventually removed by expedition teams. The reasons these bodies remain on the mountain at all come down to a combination of extreme cost, extreme risk, and simple physics. Recovery operations at these altitudes can cost tens of thousands of dollars and require a team of strong, acclimatized climbers willing to risk their own lives moving dead weight, sometimes frozen solid into the exact position the person died in, down some of the most technically demanding and exposed terrain on the planet. Porters and Sherpas, who already carry enormous physical risks simply supporting live climbers through the death zone, have been seriously injured and even killed during body recovery attempts. The numbers get thrown around in pieces, but the pattern is consistent. Sherpas are far more likely than foreign climbers to die on Everest because they spend far more of their working time in the highest camps, fixing ropes, hauling loads, and breaking trail. A single recovery mission can take days. It uses up oxygen and food. It costs thousands of dollars per Sherpa. It can fail without warning if a single anchor gives way under the weight of a frozen body. So the recovery calculus is brutal. The family pays, the porter risks, and the mountain, in most cases, simply keeps the dead. For the vast majority of the estimated 200-plus climbers who have died on Everest and never come home, the mountain that took their life has also become permanently the place where they remain. What all of this reveals isn't just the physical danger of Everest, which most people already understand in the abstract. It's something less visible and, in some ways, more disturbing. The way extreme environments change human behavior in ways that are almost impossible to predict from the outside. The climbers who passed Green Boots and later David Sharp weren't monsters. Many of them were experienced, careful, ethical people in every other part of their lives. But at 8,500 meters, with their own oxygen running low, their own judgment already compromised by cold and altitude, the moral clarity we assume we'd have in that moment simply isn't guaranteed to survive the climb with you. The death zone doesn't just strip away oxygen. It strips away certainty, memory, and, in some documented cases, the basic ability to distinguish a stranger in crisis from a landmark you've walked past 100 times before. There's a reason the story has stayed embedded in mountaineering culture for almost 30 years, resurfacing in documentaries, books, and countless retellings. It isn't really about one man in green boots or even about the storm that likely killed him. It's about what happens when human beings push themselves into an environment the body was never built to survive in, and what that environment reveals about the limits of both physical endurance and moral judgment. Everest doesn't test climbers only on their strength or their technical skill. It tests them in a place where oxygen-starved brains have to make life or death decisions in seconds, decisions that will be judged for decades afterward by people who have never stood anywhere near that altitude. Today, Green Boots is gone from view, moved to a location most climbers will never see, but the story hasn't disappeared with him. It lives on in every account from climbers who passed that alcove between 1996 and 2014, in the controversy that still surrounds David Sharp's death, and in the uncomfortable questions it raises about what any of us would actually do at 8,500 meters, gasping for air with the summit finally in sight, and a stranger curled against the rock just a few feet away. Would you stop? Would you even recognize what you were looking at? Nobody who hasn't stood in that death zone can honestly answer that question. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of this entire story. The mountain doesn't just take lives. It takes away the certainty we all like to believe we'd have about our own choices. And it leaves that uncertainty behind for the rest of us to sit with safely at sea level, wondering what we'd have done differently. What's easy to forget, watching the story unfold from thousands of kilometers away and thousands of meters below, is that everyone involved, the 3 ITBP climbers who never came home in 1996, the Japanese team caught in an impossible position on the same ridge, Mark Inglis descending with his own group after finding David Sharp, and David Sharp himself was a person who made a deliberate choice to be there. Everest doesn't ambush anyone. Every climber who attempts it knows, at least intellectually, what the death zone can do, what the odds are, and what has happened to the roughly 200 people who came before them and never left. And yet, every season, thousands still apply for permits, still spend years training, still hand over tens of thousands of dollars, and still walk past that same stretch of ridge where Green Boots once rested, chasing something that pulls harder than the fear of becoming a landmark themselves. That pull is worth sitting with for a moment because it's the real engine behind every part of the story. Reaching the summit of Everest has become, for many climbers, less about the view from the top and more about proving something to themselves that can't be proven anywhere else on Earth. The mountain doesn't care about that motivation. It doesn't distinguish between a climber chasing a lifelong dream and a climber chasing a moment of ego. It applies the same brutal physics to everyone who enters the death zone. Dwindling oxygen, thickening blood, a brain slowly losing its grip on clear judgment. And a summit that looks from below like the only thing that matters. Understanding that pull doesn't excuse what happened to David Sharp. And it doesn't answer the harder questions raised by his death. But it does explain why, year after year, new climbers keep making the same journey past the same dangerous stretch of ridge, fully aware of everything that happened there before them. In the years since Green Boots was quietly relocated in 2014, The debate his story sparked hasn't gone away. Mountaineering ethics courses and expedition briefings now often reference the 2006 incident directly, using it as a case study in the impossible calculus of high-altitude rescue. Some commercial expedition companies have since implemented stricter protocols around buddy systems and mandatory check-ins at key points along the route, partly in response to the criticism that followed Sharp's death. Whether these changes have meaningfully reduced the odds of a similar tragedy happening again is difficult to measure, because the fundamental problem, oxygen-starved climbers making irreversible decisions in seconds, hasn't disappeared. It can't disappear. It's simply what the death zone does to every single person who enters it, regardless of how many protocols exist on paper at base camp thousands of meters below.